Now let's get started and set up our environment. We'll need to install Android Studio 3.0, which contains all the new tooling for Kotlin development. We'll need to enable Kotlin development in our project creation and create our new Wikipedia app project. The first thing we'll need to do to get our development environment set up is to install Android Studio 3.0. As of fall 2017, this is still in beta, but it is required to have all the newest Kotlin tooling built into the editor. We can go to the Android Developer Downloads portal and download the latest beta. Clicking the download button will kick things off. Make sure to accept the terms and download the installer for either Mac or Windows. Since the installation process varies so much between Mac, Windows, and Linux, I'll lead you to the documentation from the Android Developer Portal on how to install Android Studio 3.0 Preview or any preview version of Android Studio, especially if you're installing alongside the stable version of Android Studio or have the Android SDK and NDK installed through some other program like using Xamarin, React Native, or some other form of cross-platform development which will already have it installed. The most important thing to remember is to not reinstall the Android SDK when installing your version of Android Studio, because having to will cause problems with your individual SDK installations, your emulators, and everything else that comes with the Android SDK. So once you have it installed, you'll see this little preview window here. We can go ahead and click on Start a New Android Studio Project since we're going to be starting from scratch with our new Wikipedia app. Now we can go ahead and fill out the fields required to kick off our application. The important things are the application name, the domain name from the company, the project location where we're going to be keeping all our files, and most importantly, to include Kotlin support. This is required in order to enable Kotlin support through the development of our application and enable all the tooling that's going to help make our lives easier when creating Kotlin files rather than Java. Now let's fill out the rest of our fields for our application name, company name, and select our location. We can hit Next, and now we can see all the different targeted Android device options that we can have. We're not going to be targeting Android Wear, TV, Android Audio, or Android Things for our Internet of Things. Instead, we're going to simply select Phone and Tablet, and select a reasonable minimum version to be supported. In this case, I'll just select 5.0 Android Lollipop, which is where Material Design started its implementation. Don't worry about selecting any particular minimum version, since we're going to be using libraries to help us with backwards compatibility. You can also use the Help Me Choose option, which will open up a diagram to explain the different distribution percentages of each of the Android operating system versions. Let's leave it at 5.0 or Android Lollipop and click Next. Here we get different templates that we can start with built into Android Studio. We can start with a basic activity, an activity with a bottom navigation, an empty activity, a full screen activity, ads, maps, a login activity, a master detail flow, a navigation drawer, a scrolling activity, a settings activity, and a tabbed activity. Each of these is going to start us off with an implementation of a specific activity that's the start of the application. This is also going to be having the backend written in Kotlin rather than Java. We can start with no activity and do everything from scratch. This will allow us to learn everything and how the process works together rather than starting with a template. However, if you want to get started faster, I would suggest starting with either basic activity, empty activity, or the bottom navigation activity, since our wireframes from the Wikipedia team specify that we'll need bottom tabs to move between our exploration page, history page, and favorites page. We'll select no activity and do everything from scratch. Now we wait for the installer to get everything started, install the proper SDK versions, and unzip the build tools that we need to start running our application. Let's move ahead to when the installation is finished. We can click Finish, and now Android Studio will open up our new application. Now that our application's project has been created, let's take a look at what we start with. We have our Gradle scripts, which include the build properties and settings that we need to install and run our application. This will include dependencies, and especially include the Kotlin dependencies we need in order to run it at runtime. You'll see that we'll have the class path in our dependencies to org.jetbrains.kotlin with the Gradle plugin for Kotlin. Now let's open up our source code and see what we have. We have our actual application here and our source code, you can see that we still have the path named Java even though we're using Kotlin. This is because all source code, regardless of language, goes under the Java subfolder. We don't start with any Kotlin files with the empty activity or no activity setting in our installation. However, if you did run with an existing template, this is where you'd see your code that starts off the application. We also have our resources folder, which includes some drawables and bitmaps for our launcher icon, which is the application icon we see in the base operating system. We also have some XML values here for different colors, strings, and styles. We'll get into those later when we talk more about Android resources. The other more important thing we have is the manifest file. This is what defines our application and allows us to add activities that are registered to the application so that we can process and run them. We also get a test folder, which includes example unit tests using Kotlin. We won't dive in much into unit testing in this course. However, there are other courses on using unit testing in Android development that might help if you're interested in learning about unit tests. If we collapse our folders back to the root, we'll see that we have some other folders, such as the build folder, which has nothing use other than a text file for version information, a Gradle folder, which has some of the properties we need in order to use Gradle for builds, the .idea folder for the editor, and the Gradle folder for running Gradle builds. We won't be needing these in particular, and all of the files we'll be needing will be under the app folder here, including the resources folder and the Java folder. You'll notice that we won't be able to run our application yet, or make it. Since we don't have any files that go into the source code, we're going to have a failed build.